Jess, the wife's gone. What do you want to watch?
Man, I don't care anymore.
Jeez, dude, keep it on your side.
Hey, terrible day. We've been sick for what, 3 weeks now? Can God not throw us a bone?
Dude, this just will not go away.
Hey, God's got bigger problems than your wimpy little man cold.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Bruh, life's not fair, God's not fair, so just deal with it. See, I told you God's not interested in helping us. We have to fend for ourselves. That's why I've concocted a special blend of essential oils. There's lemongrass for the cough, there's peppermint for your sniffles, and there's canola oil for more popcorn.
Job chapter 9 is where we're going to be today, at least start today. We've been in this series we called Bad Medicine, talking about how to avoid misery malpractice. And here's what we've said all the way along in this series, if you're just catching up with it today. Suffering is a regular part, a normal part of the human experience, at least on this side of eternity. It's something that all of us deal with. It comes for all of us, and it comes for all of the people that we live near. It comes for all of the people that we love around us. But the thing about that, even knowing that is, somehow when suffering comes for us, it still seems to catch us off guard. And when we find ourselves in suffering, we tend to lack perspective on suffering. You notice how that works? It always feels bigger than maybe it does in hindsight after you're through it, and it always seems to be more permanent than maybe it is when suffering comes for you. When you're in it, it's hard to ever see your way through it. But it's also true when you're not in suffering and somebody else that you know or somebody else that you love is in suffering, it's hard to have perspective on that. A lot of times we're far enough away from it, it looks smaller than it actually feels to them. And it also feels simpler or looks simpler than it is to them. And as a result of all of that, it's hard to have perspective on suffering. That means that most of us, we don't suffer really well when it's our turn to suffer. And most of us, if we're honest, we're not nearly as helpful to other people around us as we think we are when they're suffering. So the question for this series has been, how do we suffer well? And how do we love people well when they're suffering? And we've been looking at the suffering of a guy named Job in the Bible and some friends that come alongside him with really great intentions. They try to help Job through his suffering. They try to diagnose his problem, and then they offer him some treatment plans to get out of his suffering. But we've found, and we've seen, because we know the whole story, they get it totally wrong. And what it's shown us throughout this series is that it's totally possible to have just enough of a right view of who God is and what God sometimes does to make ourselves sound credible when we talk about suffering and we talk about God in suffering, along with just enough of a wrong view about who God is and what God does to make us extraordinarily dangerous to other people when it comes to their suffering, even if we're trying to help. Here's where we're going today. It's not just us helping other people and other people helping us that bad medicine happens and misery malpractice happens too. Sometimes we practice bad medicine on ourselves. You know, in the world that we live in today, because of YouTube, if you got enough money, you got enough patience, you got enough time, pretty much anything that's important, YouTube can show you how to do yourself, including, it seems, dentistry and plastic surgery. So Google that one of these days if you don't want to sleep for a week. It's terrifying, some of the stuff that happens. It's also heartbreaking, some of the stuff that happens. And the reason that it happens is that people, they decide they just can't stand the cost or they can't stand the pain. And they decide to take matters into their own hands. And the results are horrifying and tragic. What happens when you practice bad medicine on yourself? Well, let's just say the results aren't pretty. So what we're going to talk about this morning is it's not just Job's friends who go to work on Job's pain. Job's trying to figure it out too. All of Job's friends reach their conclusions about why Job is suffering and what he ought to do about it. Job reaches some conclusions himself. But they're not conclusions about himself, they're conclusions about God. And listen, if you've ever found yourself suffering, these are things that you've thought, even if you didn't have the courage to say them out loud. Let me just say real quick, as we get ready to look at what Job concludes about God as he goes through his suffering, because I think this is really important to notice. Have you noticed when you read through the Bible never, ever mocks a sufferer in the midst of their suffering? Never. Do you ever notice that the Bible also doesn't mute a sufferer in the middle of their suffering? The Bible doesn't ever say to the sufferer, you shouldn't say that. Don't say that out loud, even if you feel it. Doesn't mock the sufferer, it doesn't mute the sufferer. You know what it normally does for the person who's suffering? Hands them a microphone and invites them to speak up, even in their suffering. The raw, emotional truth about what they see, what they think, what they experience, what they wonder, and what they've concluded. And in some cases, the sufferers that we read in the Bible say some things that we're not totally comfortable with. In fact, if it was us or someone who was near us who said some of these things, we would say to them, no, you can't say those things. No, you can't think those things. You can't believe in God and say stuff like that. God will get you if you do. We skim by it when Job does it. We skim by it when David does it, when some of the other sufferers in Scripture do it, because they made it in the Bible. Surely it's okay for them to say it, but we don't feel like it's okay for us. We don't feel like it's okay for other people around us to speak up with this kind of raw honesty about what we see and what we feel and what we wonder and what we've concluded, and the questions that we're asking when we hurt. God doesn't smite Job for what he says. He does correct some of the things that he says. We'll see that next week. But he doesn't smite him. He doesn't smite David in the middle of David's lament. The Bible hands them a microphone and invites them to be honest about suffering in an unjust, unfair, difficult world, even in difficult circumstances. And aren't we glad? Because when Job speaks up, he's going to say some things, some of the exact same things that some of us feel right now about God, but we're not sure we're allowed to say. I want to show you this morning what they are really quickly. And then I want to point towards some of the ultimate answers that God gives, not just to Job, but to us, that we can hold on to when suffering finds us and the people that we love. We're going to fly through these, so I've put some fill in the blanks there on your worship guide notes. Even if you don't always use those, you might find it helpful for you to just write those down and stay up with us, but also to be able to go back to them later this week and take a deeper dive. So go ahead and grab those if you want to do that as well. We're going to start in Job chapter 9. One of the very first couple of things that Job says as he responds to these friends practicing bad medicine on his suffering, Job chapter 9. Look at Job chapter 9, beginning in verse 2, at what Job says in response to some of his friends. Job chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. He says, "But how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? Though they wished to dispute with him, he couldn't answer them 1 time out of 1,000. His wisdom is profound. His power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed?" If you read this whole chapter, actually, really, if you read all of Job chapter 9 and Job chapter 10, I hope you will this week, Job responds to the bad medicine of one of his friends, and you see a conclusion that Job's reached all on his own. Over and over and over through those 2 chapters, he says, God is big. God is majestic. God is powerful. God is holy. You see it here in these verses we just read. His power is vast. He's going to go on to say he moves the mountains, he shakes the foundation of the earth. But his conclusion is someone like me could never approach someone like him. Verse 16, he says, if I did, it would make it worse. He would destroy me. He would crush me. He would smite me. I don't get to ask questions. I don't get to argue my case. I don't get to reach out to God. I'm a nobody. He's God. He's big. And Job concludes, God is unapproachable. Bad medicine, view number 1, God is unapproachable. At the end of the day, Job feels like he's stuck. He knows he doesn't deserve the suffering that he's enduring, but he feels like if he asks God about it, if he questions God or he brings it up in front of God or tells God that it's not fair, that he's somehow going to dishonor God in the process, and then he will deserve the suffering that he gets. Somehow God will add suffering to the suffering Job's already enduring. So Job knows that God's the only one that can solve his problems. But he feels like God's too big or too holy, too far away, too distant, too powerful to be approachable. That's the first conclusion that Job's reached about God. God's unapproachable. Flip a couple of pages to Job chapter 16. Job chapter 16. By this point in the story, we've already seen the diagnosis and the treatment from Job's friends. They've told him your problem is either karma or bad faith, one or the other. Either you've done something wrong or you haven't done enough of something right, and God's punishing you for it. If you'd sin less or if you'd believe more, the suffering would go away. It's punishment from God for something that you've done wrong or something you haven't done enough of right. And Job responds to them, if that's true, the punishment is way out of proportion with whatever it is that I've done. Look what he says. Chapter 16, beginning in verse 12. He says, all was well with me, like I was doing fine. He shattered me. He seized me by the neck and crushed me. He's made me his target. His archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. Again and again, he bursts upon me. He rushes at me like a warrior. It's the whole theme of Job chapter 12 and 13, and then again in 16 and 17. Over and over and over again, Job cries out that God is unreasonable and unrelenting. Bad medicine number 2, that God is unreasonable and unrelenting. He says, come on, God. If you were trying to teach me a lesson, I've learned it by now. You were punishing me for something? You've made your point. God, if you're trying to send me a message received. Make it stop. God didn't make it stop. It just kept coming and coming and coming. It's like it rains, then it pours, then it rains again. And pours again. Essentially what Job's saying here in these chapters, he's saying God has totally lost his mind. He's totally out of control with his discipline. Whatever it is and whatever it's for. And he won't stinking stop. God, when are you going to make it stop? A couple of weeks ago, I talked about my battle with Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which was a neurological thing, shingles that attacked the inside of my ear and killed the nerve in my face, and I lived with total right side facial paralysis for about a year and a half, and talked about that as suffering. What I didn't tell you that week, and don't usually talk a whole lot about, is that suffering came at the end of a whole year. A whole year where my wife of less than 2 years was suffering with extraordinary migraines. Doctors at one point thought she had a brain tumor. We went for MRIs for that, walked through that fear. We walked through the fear of and just extraordinary loneliness and disillusionment, discouragement that came at the hands of a church, some church hurt and some wounds that were hard for us. And then a host of other things in our life. It was like one after another, after another, after another, and then facial paralysis. The doctors said they didn't know if it would ever go away. You think I didn't think some of these thoughts? God, this is totally out of sync. Enough already. The hand that you've dealt me, God, it's unreasonable. It's unrelenting. Make it stop. And he didn't make it stop. At least not for a really long time. That's what I was saying. So some of you came this morning saying to God, desperate for it to stop and fearing that God is unreasonable and unrelenting in your suffering. Flip over to Job chapter 21. Job chapter 21. Not only does Job believe that God is unapproachable and unreasonable and unrelenting, look what he says in Job chapter 21, verses 7 and 9. He asked God a question. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? They see their children established around them, their offspring before their eyes. Their homes are safe and free from fear. The rod of God's not on them. Skip down to verse 13. They spend their years in prosperity, go down to the grave in peace. And yet they say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Doesn't that sound familiar? Come on, God, look around. Like, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but at least I'm trying. Everywhere I look, I see people that are far less godly than me. They're living lives that are far better, more blessed than mine. Not even just like we're all suffering and I'm just suffering a little bit more than them. It's like they're not even suffering at all. Trying to follow you, God. They're trying not to follow you. And I'm the one in chemo? Come on. I'm the one going broke? Not fair. I'm the one who's widowed. I'm the one who's divorced. I'm the one with wayward children. I'm the one without children. All I've ever done is serve you, God. All they've ever done is reject you, God. But I'm the one who's suffering. God, that's not fair. And God, you're not just. That's what Job's saying. In fact, he gets even more explicit in Job chapter 27, the passage you're going to study in community groups this week. When you take a deeper dive into this, you're going to see in Job chapter 27, Job says, God, you've denied me justice. Job decides and declares out loud, God is unfair and unjust. One more, Job chapter 23. Job chapter 23, Job said, God's unapproachable, he's unreasonable, he's unrelenting, he's unfair, and he's unjust, and he adds one more thought. Job chapter 23, beginning in verse 3. He says, if only, you ever asked this, if only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. I would state my case before him. Like he doesn't know. I would tell him. Fill my mouth with arguments. Find out what he would answer me. Like, I don't know what he'd say. Maybe it'd be good. I'd consider what he'd say to me. Would he vigorously oppose me? No. He wouldn't press charges against me. The insinuation, if he knew what I'm experiencing, he wouldn't be okay with it either. Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe God is unaware. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe God doesn't know this is happening to me. I mean, he's got a universe to run. He's got a lot of people to deal with. Who am I? I don't know where he is. I can't hear his voice. I can't see his face. Maybe he doesn't know where I am. Maybe he can't hear my voice. Maybe he doesn't see my face. Maybe he delegates punishment to somebody else. And that person made a mistake and is punishing me instead, but I can't find him. I can't argue with him. I can't tell him because I can't see him or hear him. And I wonder if he can see me or hear me. Or maybe he can, and he doesn't care. Maybe he sees my suffering. And because he's not in it, he thinks it's small and simple, and he's just ready for me to get up and stop being such a baby. Rub some dirt on it and get back in the game. I mean, it's not like somebody's crucifying me. Maybe Jesus is in heaven looking at my suffering thinking, come at me when you got something big. Maybe he's unaware. Maybe he didn't care. You ever feel that way? I know God's big and powerful. I know he could stop it if he wanted to. Maybe he can't see it. Maybe he doesn't want to. I can't find him. I can't see him. I can't hear him. Maybe he can't find me. Maybe he can't see me. Maybe he can't hear me. And if he can hear me, maybe he's tired of hearing it. Maybe he's unaware. He didn't care. Gosh, that's a lonely place to be. Have you felt that? Job felt that. David felt that. I've felt that. Maybe God's aware. Maybe he doesn't care. It's bad medicine. All of these are. And we know they're bad medicine because we know something that Job doesn't know when he says it. We can see something that Job can't see when he says it. We know the whole story, beginning and the end. They only see a fraction of it. We know that when the whole story is told, God hasn't been unapproachable, unreasonable, unjust, unfair, unavailable, unaware, or uncaring in Job's suffering. Job can't see it. His friends can't see it, but we can see it. And because Job can't see it with our perspective, he's tempted to believe and assume and conclude all kinds of things about God in his circumstances that we know aren't true, the God of his circumstances. And that's exactly what the enemy wants in Job's situation and in yours, isn't it? The enemy loves for us to believe things about God that are almost true, but not true, especially in our suffering, because he knows we will never turn to someone for help that we've decided we can't trust. God is not unapproachable, not unreasonable or unrelenting. He's not unjust. He's not unaware in Job's suffering, and he's not in ours either. How do we know? Well, not just by looking at Job's story. We know by looking at Job's story, but the trick of looking at Job's story is we'd be tempted to just say, well, maybe that's just Job's story. There's another story, and it intersects with our story. It gives us confidence that God's not unapproachable. In fact, the opposite. God's not unreasonable. He's not unrelenting. He's not unjust. He's not unaware. And he certainly cares, even in our suffering. It's our ultimate confidence and our ultimate hope when we face an unfair, unjust, disproportionate suffering in this world. We call it the gospel. Good news. Who Jesus is, what happened to him, and what he accomplished on our behalf. And lest you think that it's just something for children, let's run back down the list. Because in it, God gives us some handles that we can grab a hold of, not just to get us out of hell when we die, but to walk with us through hell while we live. First, right there next to the word unapproachable, in the good news column, write Hebrews 4:16. Hebrews 4:16. The whole book of Hebrews is written to people who are suffering unimaginable suffering. And the suffering is so significant that they're tempted to walk away from their faith. Not because they don't believe it anymore, but because they are willing to do anything or say anything or believe anything or go anywhere just to make the pain stop. You're tempted to walk away from all of it. And the writer of Hebrews writes them to say, don't do that. Chapters 1-4 say, the infinite God of the universe has come near to you. The one who created the sun and the moon and the infinite stars and holds and sustains the universe in his hands came near and allowed his hands to be nailed stationary to a cross so that he could take away your punishment and give you life and access to him. He's not unapproachable. And the cross shows us. Listen to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. It says, let us then, in light of all of that, approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy, find grace to help us in our time of need. Jesus suffered explicitly so that we could know that God's not unapproachable, but to give us access to God that we can go not timidly, not delicately, but confidently to his throne, to find mercy and grace to help us, not just when we're kids, not just to keep us out of hell, but as people who walk step after step after step through hell, to hold us close to him, to walk with confidence. God's not unapproachable. He's come near so that we can approach him with confidence. That's great news. It's not the only part of the great news. What about unreasonable and unrelenting? Next to that, write Hebrews 10, verses 34 and 35. And by the way, all of these are all over the New Testament. I'm just trying to give you one in each slot so that you can look there this week and dive a little deeper. But this is everywhere in the New Testament. Look what Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34 says. It says, you suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you know that you yourselves have better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You hear what the writer of Hebrews is saying? This isn't the end of the story. That wasn't the end of your life. That wasn't the end of your story. It goes on to say, persevere, because even though you're walking through hard times, he's coming back for you. There's going to be an end to suffering. He's going to put an end to death. Death is going to die. And he's not wasting time. He hasn't gone passive. He's patient. But for those who are in Christ, no suffering is permanent. God isn't unrelenting. We're unreasonable. Next, is God unfair? Is God unjust? Sometimes it seems that way, doesn't it? And in some ways, the answer is yes and no. Unjust, never. God is never, ever, ever unjust. Unfair? Often. God's often unfair. We talked about that on week 1. Karma is fair, isn't it? Roots and fruits, you get what you deserve, that's fair. But that's not good news. We don't want fair. There's no hope in karma. The good news is God's not a God of karma. God's a God of grace. And yet grace is decidedly not fair by definition. In fact, the Christian hope rests on the unfairness of God combined with the justice of God. In fact, that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3, verses 25 and 26. Write that out to the other side of unfair and unjust. Our hope is anchored in the fact that God presented Jesus as our substitute. There on the cross, Jesus got what he did not deserve. The cross is horrifically, cosmically unfair, so that you and I could receive forgiveness and hope and life. Grace is horrifically, cosmically not fair. but it's just. That's the argument Paul's making in Romans chapter 3. Look at verse 26. It says, He, God, did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Paul's argument is Jesus received the unfairness of God so that he could receive the justice of God for us. That we could receive the unfairness of God in grace. That's incredibly good news. Might we still face injustice on this side of eternity? Well, Jesus did. In fact, do you remember at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus is hanging on the cross and the people are walking by making an argument to him about the fairness and justice of God? And they say, if you're really the Son of God, call on God, see if he'll save you. Because if you're really innocent, God's not going to let us get away with this. So call on him. If you're really the Son of God, come down off of the cross. But he was innocent. And God allowed him to die because God's just. God was accomplishing something in his justice and in Jesus' innocence, even on their behalf, as they mocked him, hanging on the cross. Listen, if God had a grander purpose for the innocent, unfair, unjust suffering of Jesus on the cross, isn't it possible, at least plausible, that he's got a grander purpose for your suffering today that you and I just don't understand yet, but that isn't in conflict with his justice and will allow us to be recipients, even though we can't see how, of his grace? Last thing. Isn't the cross the ultimate proof that God's not unaware and that he really does care about us? They're to the side of the assumption that Job has made that God is unaware and doesn't care. Write 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3-5. And really, we could fill up that chart with passages just about this topic that remind us that God is near the brokenhearted, that God takes the suffering of his people personally. Remember in the book of Acts when Saul is persecuting the church of God and people are being thrown into prison and people are being killed for their faith? They're suffering extraordinary, horrific things, and Jesus shows up on the scene in front of Saul. You remember what Jesus says to Saul? He says, Saul, why are you persecuting them? That's not what he says. He says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus takes the suffering personally. God sees and hears and knows the suffering of every single one of his children. He's near and he's aware and he cares. And listen to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3-5. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3-5 says, praise to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, this is written at the hand of a guy who's in prison, suffering horrific things, unjustly accused. He's there writing people who are suffering. He says, praise be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. You hear what he's saying? When we look at the suffering of Jesus, when we find ourselves suffering like Jesus, we find hope and comfort, not just enough comfort for us for the moment, but enough comfort to overflow out of us to comfort others who suffer as well. Not with platitudes, not with shallow, pithy statements. The reminder that if you'd stood near the foot of the cross and watched that innocent man suffer like John did, like Mary did, like the unnamed centurion did, If you'd watched that innocent man be crucified, you would have said, this is senseless. This is unfair. This is unjust. Where is God in this? And in that moment, God was nearer to this than any of them had any idea. And he was accomplishing something through it. It was far more grand than anyone thought. He was securing the possibility for death to die once and for all, for suffering to stop, for the curse to be broken, and for all of us to receive the gift of life that's truly life, even in our troubles. While we wait to realize that hope, ultimately, we can wait comforted with hope that's as certain as an empty grave because of a God who came near. Would you pray with me? Father, I know so many of the people in this room. I know their stories. Some of them, the hurt that they're experiencing even in this moment, the questions that they're asking. Lord, I pray that they would not mute themselves in the suffering or expect that you would mute them, but that they would confidently, boldly approach your throne and cry out to you what they see and experience, what they feel, and what they've concluded. And then, Lord, just as 2 Corinthians 1 said, I pray that they would find themselves comforted by you, that you would draw near to them even in their suffering and remind them that you're near and that you care. And then just as 2 Corinthians 1 said, Lord, that they would find themselves comforted by others as well, who are overflowing with comfort that they don't feel, who could love them well, who could lean with them into you and find hope and comfort and grace in their time of need. For the person who showed up today, Lord, who always just thought God was a big cosmic guy in the sky, who was angrily looking down at them, waiting for them to make a mistake so he could catch them and smite them and hurt them. Pray that this morning would be a morning when they recognize that you came near, not to punish them, but to take punishment for them and to give them life and forgiveness and hope as a gift. I pray that they would receive it this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.